My name is Ruth Turbeville. I grew up in northern Maine on the Canadian border, as far northeast as you can go in the United States. Beautiful country. I went to schools that had 8 grades, one teacher, 8 grades. Did not have cars in the winter. The state was so poor they couldn't keep the roads plowed. Consequently, it was horse and buggy or horse and pung. In the summer, there were a few cars. Going to school, we didn't have school buses. Most of the schools I walked to, but in my 4th grade, the school was far out. And in the winter, the snow was quite deep there. We had a school team, 2 horses drawing a big old box-like thing, no windows, benches on either side, and the only window was the front. And we had a little wood-burning stove to keep us warm because the weather could drop to 50 below, and the snow was pretty high. But it was fun, and we didn't know any difference, so we thought we were in utopia, and we were. We loved our life, loved our teachers, one teacher for 8 grades, so we got along pretty good. And over the years, I think the year that I started ended my 3rd grade. One summer I looked up and there was a dot in the sky, and the dot grew and got bigger. And it was an airplane. I'd never seen an airplane before. And consequently, it was a mail plane flying the mail from Boston up through to northern Maine. And when I saw that plane, I knew that was for me. And then I started hearing about Amelia Earhart. And of course, Lucky Lindbergh was a little prior to her. And I'd been interested in him, but we didn't get a lot of information because we didn't have radios even, and didn't have a library. But you'd hear things, word of mouth. And then, of course, there was, I can't think of his name now. I'll come back to it. But anyway, I knew I wanted to fly. And by the time I was
Howard Hughes? Were you thinking of Howard Hughes?
No. Wrong Way Corrigan.
Oh, yes, Wrong Way Corrigan.
And these were all fun stories, you know. And you got to fly, get up there. And my parents, you know, there weren't any planes around other than I saw that one plane. And a few years later, my dad worked a farm in the summer, and we hired men to come in and harvest Irish potatoes. That was Irish potato country. And one man kept coming back every year, and his name was Kazan, and I was just a young little girl, and he was just the nicest guy. He'd tell me stories about the South, and he'd been all over the United States. Interesting character. So he knew that I was interested in airplanes. So in those days, a flour that you cook would come in these big bags. It said Mother's Best, and those bags were always used for aprons or many things. But anyway, Kazan got a hold of one of those bags, and he made a parachute, a great big parachute, and for a weight he had a rock on it. And we'd go up to the top of one of those New England barns and throw it out, and it would just barely break open before it would hit the ground. Well, Kazan happened to hear that they were going to have some flight rides in Caribou, Maine. So I started bugging my mother that, no, you're not going up in an airplane. And so Kazan said, oh, please let her go. He said, I'll pay her way. It cost a whole $1, which was a fortune back then. So my mom said, well, she can go, but we're going with her. She's not going alone. So I don't know what it was, maybe a tri-motor Ford or something like that. But we took the parachute, and we went up in this plane. And didn't go far or high, just circled the airport. And Kazan asked the pilot if he could open the door and let me throw my parachute out, which I did. And that flight sold me. That's where I wanted to be.
That's fantastic because the first time I went up in a small plane was a Beechcraft Bonanza flying around Des Moines, over Des Moines, Iowa. Frank Berlin was a pilot, and he was military, and he was a major, and I enjoyed that so much. I came back, and when I got into college, I took a number of lessons.
Yeah.
While I had the money, you know.
Yeah.
I took 5 or 6 lessons, and just thoroughly enjoyed it. I remember the day that he let me have the controller.
Yeah.
Very sensitive. You lean, that's where you go. But I remember that was a wonderful experience.
Yeah. Well, this was in the 30s. I was born in 1924, and this was before we even heard of World War II. That was just a few years later is when we finally got a radio, and we'd hear about Hitler and marching through these countries. And I can remember hurrying home from school because the news would come on at a certain time, and I wanted to know exactly where Hitler was. I don't know why, but when he marched through Poland, all of Czechoslovakia, and took over these countries, and afraid that he'd get England or France. So I guess that was it. And that was more or less my growing up, was on, farm country. And my dad was a lumberjack in the winter and a farmer in the summer. And I grew up
finishing your high school, and then how you came to be in the Navy.
I didn't go to a high school per se. When I got out of the 8th grade, I went to, back then they had teachers, state normal schools. And it was a 5-year course. You had you consolidated 4 years of high school into 3 because you only took subjects that applied to teaching. And then you took 2 years of college, all in the same school. And the name of my school was, Madawaska Training School. And when you graduated from there, you had a teaching license. And every 2 years you had to take a refresher course. But the last year I was in training school, the war had started, of course, in the European theater. And also, that was the year, I think, that Pearl Harbor was bombed. And the way we found out about Pearl Harbor, we were renting, my mother was renting rooms to the local high school girls, and one of them was a telephone operator. Our telephone operator, we were on the Canadian border, was for Fort Kent, Maine, and Clare, Canada. She operated it. And a couple of days after Pearl Harbor, we didn't even know Pearl Harbor had happened. We were so far out of it. She heard that her brother had been killed in Hawaii. He was a CB. And that was our first introduction to Pearl Harbor. And then we really started getting news on the radio. So what they did with my last class in teachers training school, Maine is a small state, sparsely populated at the time. And one of the finer jobs was teaching, and a lot of men taught these elementary schools. So instead of us taking our training in the model school for teaching that year, they took like the top half of the class, and we replaced the men that were drafted, and we filled those schools for a half a year. And I took school in the back settlement because it paid $2 a month more because the roads weren't plowed, and I'd have to ski or snowshoe to my school. And I think my monthly salary was $20, but I got $2 extra. And I loved it. And I like teaching. I like children. And then, excuse me, I'd come back, we all came back, the top half of the class, and took the rest of our training that year, and the bottom half went out and replaced us. But no one replaced my school. It was so far out. And there was a little story behind that. They weren't going to replace the teacher. They weren't going to let anybody teach there that year because they were a bunch of lumberjack children. They were kind of rough. And they had thrown the last teacher out down a flight of steps and broken her shoulder. But I still wanted that school because my cousin lived close and I could live at her house and their house and walk to school or snowshoe. And they weren't going to let me have it. So I went to my coach. I was big in basketball and volleyball. I was very athletic. And I said, now, Coach Powell, you know that those children can't hurt me. And I want that school. It pays $2 a month more. I want it. So he said, I'll see what I can do. So he talked to the principal of Madawaska Training School, who in turn spoke with the superintendent of schools. I don't remember his name. And they allowed me to teach there. And I loved those children. And they never did hurt me. And the
kids that liked the teachers would always come right in. Would always help them and encourage them and do things for them and all of that. Yeah, I taught for, so
Yeah.
Come right in, Brother John. We'll turn this on pause, okay?
good.
He checked my roll every day. If he needs something done, he'd run to the office or run to another. He was my errand boy.
And those kids cried when I left that school. And they didn't get another teacher. They never had another teacher in that school after me. I took my granddaughter up there, wanted to show her that school. It was gone.
Okay, let's try to get a little bit more before we call it a day. Where were we?
I was at school.
Okay, keep carrying on right there, right where you were. And by the way, you are a wonderful storyteller. You look really nice in the picture I have here. You speak beautifully. Your stories are great. This is going to be a terrific video if we ever get it done. It's going to be really, really nice.
Well, anyway, back to my little school. I fell in love with every one of those children. And consequently, they liked me. And the school bully, I made him my friend. And he was the one that had to go to school early in the morning. The only heat we had, and it's cold up there, was a wood-burning stove. And his name was Gilbert Voisin. And it was Gilbert's job to have that fire roaring hot when I got to school in the morning. And it would be warm. He kept it warm. And I just depended on him for everything. But he was a lumberjack's son, and he had missed a lot of school, so he was quite old when he was in the 8th grade. But when I left that school, we all cried. And I remember Christmas party I had for them. We went out and cut our own tree. There's a lot of trees in Maine, that part of Maine, and having lumberjack kids, they knew how to pick a good one. And we had the biggest tree, and we made paper ornament, trimmed it with cones, you name it. It was beautiful. And one little boy, 5th grader, he was a darling child, and he gave me a box of chocolate-covered cherries. Back then, they were everywhere. That was one of the popular candies. And he said, now, Miss Labby, if you don't like these, I'll take them back. And they were poor. We were all so poor. And I said, I love them, but what I'm going to do, I'm going to share them. And I just loved those children. So anyway, that was my teaching experience. And I knew had I pursued teaching as a career, I'd starve to death because I spent my $22 a month on those children. I bought them a little croquet set. I bought them a bat. And all these things might not sound like much, but back then, it was a fortune to get a hold of those. And also, what we would do, I took the older ones. We were 7 miles from downtown Fort Kent, and they had never been to movies. And there was a little movie hall in Fort Kent. And I took them, we skied. One night, Saturday afternoon, we skied to Fort Kent because the roads weren't plowed, remember, and the drifts would pile up, you know, a lot of snow. And took all of them except maybe the first 4 grades, you know. They weren't we all went to the movies. And then we skied back at night. It was beautiful. The moon was shining down on that snow, was glistening. I love that part of the world. And I love those children.
Seemed like a wonderful time you had.
But anyway, that was my teaching experience. And from then, my mom and dad had rented our house out, and they had gone down to Connecticut, Waterbury, Connecticut, to work in the plants, the war plants, because wages home were like 50 cents an hour or less. They're very small. You couldn't make money. And so they went to the war plants, and my mother worked at the Waterbury watch factory, which had been converted into a war plant testing bomb flares. And I remember them saying that they made the roof of that plant look like a swimming pool, so that if we got bombed, which of course we never did, they'd think that was a swimming pool and that they'd be safe. And my daddy worked in a brass factory. And of course we know brass was very important in the war, the bullets and what have you. But when I graduated from teacher's training that summer, I wasn't old enough to go into the service. I had to wait until September for my birthday. And I worked at Waterbury watch factory testing bomb flares, which were a little bitty gear like you see in a clock. And you pick them up with tweezers and you put them in this little wheel thing and turned it to make sure they were true, that they weren't bent or anyway. And you got paid by the weight. And believe me, it took a lot of those little bomb flares, Kennedy weight. You really had to work to make a little money, but money was good. And from that point, I decided this is it. Every daddy would come home and he'd say, back then, of course, everybody who had children in the service, their sons mostly, they'd be a flag. They'd have 1 or 2 stars. They were navy blue with a gold fringe and a gold star, and that meant they had 1 child in the service, or they'd have 2, 3 flags. And Daddy'd come home and he'd say, Mr. Michaud's children, he's got 3 stars in his window. And my dad didn't have a son, he had 2 daughters. And I thought, I want Daddy to have a star. So the more I thought about it, I'm going in the service. And after right about just before my birthday, I went to the recruiter. And I was going to go into the Army because I could have gotten in as an officer. They still had their officer training schools open. But my mama said, no, you're not going into the Army. You are not going into the service. That's just not right. And so the little recruiter came home, and my mother was very insulting. But the little girl was so nice, and she understood. And I was so embarrassed, and I was so angry that Mama wouldn't let me go in. So when that little girl left, I said, Mom, make up your mind. I am going in the service. I'm going up to the post office right now, and I'm enlisting in the Navy. And you're not going to stop me because I'm going to be 20, I think was the age, the magic age. And so I went up, I got my papers, filled them out, sent them in, and got called in to report from Waterbury, Connecticut, to New York City. And I'll never forget the address. Our address in Maine, in Fort Kent, Maine, was 33 Main Street. And where I had to report to in New York was 33 Pine Street. And I'd never been in the city, never. And as a matter of fact, Waterbury is big, you know. But I was quite worldly after getting into Waterbury, so I had to go on train, and a bunch of us had to report and go down. And guess who was on my heels? My mother took the day off. She said, you are not going to New York without me. Okay. So here we go, and I check in at 33 Pine Street, And they were very nice. And first of all, they gave me a written. And they came back to my mother and they brought me back and they said, she passed with flying colors. Well, of course I did. I just got out of teacher's training school. I knew all the answers. I was good in math. No problem. And I could see Mama say, oh, no, please, no. But she didn't say anything. So then I had to go in for my physical, and she thought, well, maybe she won't pass her physical. Well, I was an athlete, basketball, volleyball, you name it, I could swim. They came out and they said, she's really a specimen, she's really a healthy girl. And I could not get in officers training because the Navy had already closed their officers' school. So I had to go into any job as an apprentice. But first I had to get through boot camp. So boot camp, and Mama gave up the fight right there. They sent us to Hunter College in the Bronx in New York. So a bunch of us boarded the train in Waterbury, Connecticut, and I have pictures of that somewhere. And we all went to the Bronx, to Hunter College. And we rode subways. It was just amazing what I saw out there. As a matter of fact, when I went to 33 Pine Street, I had never seen a revolving door before. And I went around the wrong side and it made a strange noise. I thought I broke it. But I was pretty green. We grew up in the woods and nothing. So anyway, Bronx College, Hunter College in the Bronx, there was a huge armory. That's where we did our training. And they marched us. You would not believe the miles we put in, and the exercises and the shots we got. And then after we got 3 or 4 weeks of training behind us, we'd have to stand shore patrol duty out at the reservoir, and it's cold. The wind off that water in the winter was really cold. And we wore what the sailors wore on board the ships. They had these havelocks, just this much of your face would show. Great big suits, and we had a billy club, Why we were protecting the reservoir, I have no idea. And the children would get out of school and they'd march by us and they'd say, now, are you a boy sailor or a girl sailor? Because all they could see was this much of our face. And they kept us a couple of weeks longer than we normally would have stayed in the Bronx because of weather south. As a matter of fact, when they sent me to Millington, which was a naval air station where we trained pilots, Navy cadets, in bi-wings, little bi-wing planes, not these wonderful things you see out there now, but they were fun planes. But they held us up because of the weather, and we couldn't take the southern route. We had to go via Chicago and down because the weather, I can't remember, was really bad. And when we got to Millington, I'd never seen black people much. We didn't have black people where I grew up, and it was really a curiosity to me. It was really different. And they had magnolia trees in Memphis. The flowers were as big as dinner plates, and didn't have anything like that in Maine. We had lilac bushes and hollyhocks and pretty flowers, but these big, wonderful trees, just beautiful. And I remember one of the songs was Memphis in June, in Sweet Oleander. And every time I hear that song, I think of Memphis. But anyway, we got off the train in Millington and boarded these buses to the base. And the base was quite big. There were 2 bases. One side of the highway was a technical training school. And the side that I was assigned to was a naval air station where we trained the cadets. And I loved it. And it was the best job I ever had.
Okay, you want to take a break?
Yeah.
You want to get some water?
Am I being mouthy?
Fantastic. You're doing great. I'm going to turn the camera off. Okay, you're back on.
When I checked into the Naval Air Station, if you recall, all the schools were closed. So we had to go in as apprentice and learn on the job. Well, control tower was closed. Several other things I was interested in were closed. But mechanic school was open. I understood that if you did the mechanics, you could draw what they call flight skins, which meant if you had an open period, you could go flying with the pilots when they practiced, the instructors, of course, not the cadets. And I wanted to get up in those airplanes more than anything. So anyway, I said, okay, I'll do mechanic work. Well, it was simple. It was on the little biplanes, and they'd teach you the 30-hour check, which you check the seat belts and you check the altimeters and various parts of the plane to make sure they were operating correctly. And it would take an hour maybe. And that was simple enough. But there was a wave that was the top mechanic of the group. Her name, we went by last names, and her name was Brooks. We called her Brooksy. She was fantastic. She was a good mechanic. And I thought, I want to be like Brooksy. And they really respected her. And so she was part of my training. And I tried to copy her. She was a big girl like I was, tall and pleasant and helpful. But a lot of my training was sweeping out that big big hanger with a push broom. Sometimes you'd be late for chow by the time you got that humongous hanger clean. That was part of it. But anyway, I was still around planes. And one time they assigned me, when I thought I was really breaking out of the pack and becoming a mechanic, they gave me a job of pulling the wheel. It was the left front wheel, I'll never forget. It was a windy day. Taking that wheel up to the shop, and they did a lot of replacing, not repairing in the Navy. But anyway, what I had to do was take that wheel up there, get a new one back, and I had to take a strip that was a brake shoe and mount on where the wheel went, then put the wheel on. That was my job, and it was simple. But I was so proud. I jacked up the plane. There was a little jack that went up the belly of the plane, got it up, pulled the wheel off. And I had arrived, and so happy. I picked up my wheel and my little brake pad, and I started back to my little Stearman bi-wing airplane, and it was a windy day, and it was up on that one jack, and the wings, it was going. And I thought, oh, it's going to fall off. Well, what I hadn't done, I made a terrible mistake. There were things they call chocks that you put between the aileron and the solid part of the plane to where the ailerons wouldn't flap, and then your rudder. You had a chalk that kept it from flapping, and the wind wouldn't blow your plane over, I guess. Well, I didn't know about the chocks, and my plane fell off of the jack right onto that where the wheel was supposed to be. Well, I just knew I was going to have brig time or be drummed out of the service. I just was brokenhearted. And they came out and they said, no, it's not that big a deal. So they helped me get it on the way. Well, the next day, I was told to report to the supervisor of aviation training. And everything in the Navy was initialized. It was the SAT. And I thought, oh, he's found out about my wheel, that I didn't do a good job. I'm really going to get it now. So I reported to the supervisor of aviation training, and his yeoman was a young man that looked 10 feet tall to me because I was really frightened when I checked in there. And he just wasn't as friendly as I wanted him to be. He said, "And what do you want?" And I said, "Well, I was told to report to the supervisor of aviation training." And he said, "Oh yeah, the SAT, okay." Just sit there a minute or stand there, whatever it was. And I was trembling in my boots because I knew I was on my way out. So finally he ushered me into it was the lieutenant commander office, and he was there writing, never looked up, and I stood there for quite a while, and I was so uncomfortable. And finally he looked up and he said, "Yes, what is it?" And I said, "I was told to report to the SAP instead of." Well, man, I didn't realize what a mistake I'd made, you know. He bent over laughing, and I thought, what is wrong with him? And so finally he said, "It's SAT." And I said, "Oh, I'm so sorry." So when he got through laughing, thank God he had a sense of humor, he said, "Well, what I wanted to speak to you about, I want to pull you off the mechanics line." Oh. And he said, "I have a job for you, and it's in the training division." And I said, "But I want to be a mechanic. I don't want another job." He said, "But we need you as on the flight line." I said, and he said, "Why are you so determined not to take the job? It's a wonderful job. You'll like it. I've checked your background. You're perfect for the job." And I said, "I don't even know what the job is." And he said, "Well, tell me why you don't want it, and then we'll go from there." And I said, I want a job where I can draw flight skins, which meant I could go up on my period, you know, my non-working periods if there was an open seat." And he said, "Is that all that's bothering you? Would you take the job?" And I said, That's it right there. I want to fly." So he said, "Let me make a call." So he made a call, and he said, "Anytime you have an off period and there's an open seat with the flight instructors, you can fly. Now will you take the job?" And I said, "Oh, yes, sir." Well, I took the job, and it's the most wonderful job I ever had. I loved it. They assigned me X number of flight instructors, and I have pictures of a lot of them, and X number of cadets that were going to learn to fly. And we had 4 stages plus night school and ground school. And like A stage, you know, they flew with instructors that got ready to sew, etc. And then they were in B stage, they did aerobatics somewhat. In C stage, and they do cross countries and what have you. And you had to keep up with that, plus their ground school, plus the airplanes you assigned them to, plus the instructors. It was a very responsible job, but I was never in harm's way like our boys that were out fighting for us. And I loved it. And I got in, I could sandbag, and I always saw to it that my work was cut up and I caught up, and that I would have time to go flying with the instructors. And then I got really smart. I started asking the instructors who had a military certificate that could sign my flying time that would count towards my getting a civilian license. And one of them was a Texas guy, and he was the nicest man. He was, they called him Deepwater Willie, and he wore torque boots. Well, his torque boots were cowboy boots, and he was easygoing, slow talking, and he had a civilian ticket where he could sign. He had an instructor's ticket where he could sign. Just because they were instructors in the Navy didn't mean they could sign your time. So I used to fly with Deepwater Willie, and his name was Wilson, the initial R. And then they assigned French cadets to me because my dad was French, and I had a smattering of, I could speak French somewhat, not as well as the guys that came over from France. But they sent their officer that they sent with their cadets was General de Gaulle's son, Lieutenant de Gaulle. And he looked just like his dad, big nose, mustache, but skinnier, smaller frame. And all these French cadets, they were the cream of the crop from France. They were very well educated, very mannerly, likable. They spoke English, some, you know, broken English, but they were good. And so they just indoctrinated them into our group. They just had the French cadets. It was interesting. General de Gaulle, at that time, was the French leader. He was like their, prime minister or whatever, like our president. And I did get to meet him. He came over. And they were just really a good group. They were interesting. And they worked well with our instructors. The only thing is, if you sent them out on a cross country, they were aces in ground school. They were so well educated. Everything was fine. But the difference in the language between the pilots, the instructors, and the French sometimes got in their way. And of course, the terrain was a lot different over here than it was in France. A lot of times they'd get lost on their cross country. Of course, our boys did too sometimes, but not as much as the French cadets. They were entertaining and very nice. So anyway, we drifted through that, and I enjoyed that job. And several little things. We had some prisoner of war on our base. They were Germans. And we probably had 100 or so. We didn't see them much. They had to clean up the base, pick up trash, help the maintenance men. They were very well treated, and I think they were relieved to be with us. No one bothered them. But the one thing that I remember, the Waves barracks were separate from the men's barracks. They were across the way. And we were very well taken care of and respected. And we had a maintenance man come in with one of the prisoner of war, and he was a nice-looking young German man. And he didn't smile much. And there just happened to be a piano in that big room that we had. As somebody, out of the goodness of their heart, must have thought, those girls need a piano. It never got played. But as they walked through, whatever their job was, the maintenance man and the prisoner of war, he looked at that piano, and the way he touched it, it was almost a caress. And one of the Waves was watching it, and she spoke to the maintenance guy and said, "I think he plays the piano. Ask him if he wants to play it." And the man asked him. And that young German, nice-looking young man, sat down at that piano, and the way he played, you almost had a tear in your eye for him. And I'll never forget that prisoner of war. But they were well treated. I just wish that our boys had been well treated in the German camps, and especially in the Japanese camps. They weren't that lucky. But overall, life was good. I enjoyed my job, and I got a lot of flying in, and graduated a lot of guys, even though I was not a hands-on pilot, but I got them through their training syllabus. And the only thing that would hurt is the bad part of it. There's always sad parts to war, is the guys that were cadets, they loved to fly, they wanted to be pilots. If the war was going good, they had to really be great at what they were doing, or they'd be washed out. They probably needed just one more chance. They would have been excellent pilots. But if the war was going bad and we needed more pilots, we passed the good ones with the bad. That I didn't like. But we had our Czech pilots. We had some that were really tough guys, and we'd call them hard-nosed Czech pilots. And then there was like Wilson from Texas. He was Santa Claus. He did his best to get those boys through. So if you had a cadet that was having a hard time, you'd assign Santa Claus Czech pilot to him, give him a little extra push. It was just games, but it was good times, and I've always loved the time I spent in the service. From there, when I got discharged, I remained in the South, and I went to work for American Airlines. And I worked for American Airlines 33 years. Prior to that, I worked for Greyhound Bus Lines 5 years, and then American Airlines 33 years. So I've had a good life, and I did get my pilot's license. And I enjoyed every minute of flying. Thank you for listening.
When did when were you discharged and where? When and where?
I was discharged in Millington. And it was after the war. I think it was, the end of 1946. The war was over. One thing that I meant, can you cut me in?
Sure, this is going to be edited so we can cut
Yeah.
and paste any way you want.
One thing I want to tell you is my last leave when I was in the service. Of course, I'd have to go all the way to Maine, which was a long ways. And not on a plane, you went on a bus or a train or whatever, ground transportation, because the troops were moving back and forth and you stood up a lot. You didn't always have a seat on the train or the bus you did. But I remember taking the train, and I had to change in Washington, D.C. And I had over a half a day layover to catch the train out of there to get up to Maine. So I took a tour or two. And when I came out of the building from one tour, I heard this racket, this noise. And I looked up, and the sky was solid airplanes. It was the bombers, the fighters, you name it. They were wing to wing. You could hardly see the sky. The sky was black with planes. And people were yelling, and we'd been inside, and they had declared the war was over. It was the end of the war, and I just happened to be there at that time. And I'll never forget the sound. And the people were just dancing in the streets. I nearly missed my train home.
August of 45.
It was wonderful. Just wonderful. And I can still hear those planes just roaring. And they were just perfect formation. The bombers, the fighters, the escort planes, just, it was beautiful. And to think the war was over. That was a sight to see. So, for a country girl, I did okay.
Tell us how you got back home.
Well, I continued. I was still Navy, of course. I was on leave. I wasn't discharged just because the war was over. So I went on up home. And Maine at that time had train service, and it was B&A, Bangor and Aroostook. Aroostook was the county that I lived in that grew the Irish potatoes. And I remember was probably my third leave where I had gone up home. And when I got on the train to the Bangor and Aroostook, B&A, and got into Maine, Portland, Maine, and I saw all the lobster traps out there because, you know, Maine's big on lobsters down on the coast. And the conductor was the sweetest old man, and he always made us feel so welcome if we were in the service. And he said, you like lobster? And I said, oh, yeah, I love lobster. You like blueberry pie? Maine is big for lobsters and blueberries. And I said, oh, I haven't had blueberry pie since I left home. But he said, dinner's going to be on me. And he said, you go up to the dining car at such and such a time, and they'll show you where your table is. And I got up there at specified time, had a big lobster, Maine lobster, and I had blueberry pie. And just sweetest old gentleman that was the conductor. The times were so great. I just love this country.
Welcome home.
Thank you.
That's the way it was in those days.
Yeah.
And some of the veterans I've got on tape that were hitchhiking,
Yeah.
10 to 20 minutes at most, and they were picked up and gone.
Oh, yeah.
Because everybody wanted to pick up a veteran.
Yeah.
Everybody wanted to pick up a soldier.
Yeah, you didn't.
They can help them out.
Yeah. And, you know, the whole time I was never in harm's way. I always felt safe in my country.
Do you have any recommendations for the kids, the younger kids today? This is a question I like to ask all my veterans that I interview. What would you recommend to the young people today concerning the military?
Concerning what?
Concerning the military. For example, do you think
I don't.
do you think that young people would benefit from being part of the military services today?
Not all of them. It takes. You have to be motivated in that direction. You have to want. I know young people today that they could not survive. They're so dependent on people. But you have to be a free spirit, independent. You have to have a lot of curiosity and want to travel. And you have to have a need for people. You have to like people. You know, get out there and find out how the other half lives. It doesn't matter who they are, what they have. You know, that doesn't matter. It's what they have in here. But no, it's on an individual basis. Not everybody's cut out for that sort of life. But it's a good life if you can take the good with the bad and the bad with the good. And just remember, things that happen to you aren't always somebody else's fault. Sometimes it can be your fault, you know. Just have to swing with it. I loved it.
What was your worst day? Can you remember the
Yeah.
worst experience that you ever had
Oh, yeah.
while in the military? Will you mind talking about that?
Well, it's so silly. I know. We had, on the base, we had a huge indoor swimming pool. Huge. And you learned to do strafers dives. And all it meant was jumping off the tower. And when you hit the water, pull up so that you go all the way down. So if you were shot down in the ocean and they were strafing you with bullets, you'd want to go as far. So we'd practice strafing dive. And you'd practice diving with a helmet on, not getting your head jerked off. And just things you didn't really have to do. But it was fun to do. You know, anything, if you like to compete. And I was not a great swimmer at the time. I ended up being a wonderful swimmer. You know, I was a water safety instructor. You can't get much better than that, but I didn't do that in the military. I was sort of a dog paddler and, you know. So anyway, a bunch of us waves went over one night and we were diving off them. And I remember one of the French cadets that kind of followed me around, you know, up on the tower, and he was saying, "Jump, jump, jump, le bay." And I thought, I wish you'd go away. And he was standing there with these starched khakis on, or whatever they were, you know, just spick and span. And I thought, I'm going to jump. And I jumped as close to him as I could get, and I did a cannonball. And he was wet from top of his head to his toes. And I thought, yes. So anyway, we swam around having a good time, and I got down to one corner and I was just doing kicks. And all of a sudden I was looking for the girls I had come with, and they had already started, you know, going away. And it was getting late. And I looked up and there were about 4 sailors right around the corner. And I knew I had put myself in a bad spot. And I had on, back then, you were pretty well covered with your bathing suits, but I had on trunks and it was 2-piece. And the back was held by one big button. And I think they were trying to break that button off. But I was trying to get away from that corner and they wouldn't let me. And they kept pushing me under and pulling me up. And I hadn't learned how to breathe properly, you know, like I can now do. in the water. And I've never been so frightened in my life, because they just had a look in their eye that I didn't like. And eventually, they let me go. But I was never caught out alone after that. That was my worst experience in the Navy. And it seemed like it lasted for hours, and I know it was probably maybe 10, 15 minutes, but they just kept pushing and holding me under and then pulling me up. I did not like, that's the worst. Nothing bad happened to me other than that.
They were messing with you. They were trying to see how much you was going to take.
And I took a lot. And I never begged, I never screamed, I just could say, hey guys, let me, but I had a bad feeling about it. But I was very trusting. I always seemed to be protected. People took care of me. I think it's because I just, thought the whole world was a playground, and I loved to play.
2 more questions and I'm done.
Okay.
What was the funniest thing that ever happened to you in the military?
A lot of funny things.
Probably a number of them, but can you remember one that was just particularly funny, hilarious?
Yeah, one time.
Let me turn this thing off. Shuts up. Okay, let's go ahead and tell us your funny story.
There are a couple of things that sort of tickled my fancy, but my office was under the control tower and above operations. I was sandwiched between the two. And it was a small office, and then my lieutenant commander was over to one side in his own little room. And there was one of the guys that worked for my lieutenant commander. He was a yeoman. He called me Mop Top because I had a lot of curly hair. And so he had been down in operations for some reason. And he came up and he said, well, Mop Top, guess what? And I said, what's going on? He said, Robert Taylor is in operations. Well, Robert Taylor was a really handsome movie star, but he was also in the Navy. And he was in operations, I guess, checking the weather for flight out or whatever. And I wanted to see him. And I couldn't get away and go down. I just wouldn't do that. Well, the way our stairwell was, we didn't have a railing around it. You came up these stairs, on the floor, just no railing. So I went over there and I got down on my hands and knees and tried to look under the stairwell to see Robert Taylor. And I felt a pat on my fanny and I looked around and he said, what are you looking for? And it was Robert Taylor. And I said, and he got tickled. He started to laugh. But anyway, Robert Taylor patted me on the fanny. I thought that was kind of fun.
That's neat.
Oh, well, it was a kind word. He was so handsome. He knew he had me.
Last question is, did your religion play much role in your military career? Were you involved in the churches or any?
We had in this big room, big recreation room maybe. They did all kinds of things in there. We saw movies, they'd have movies. And they'd have a chaplain. And it didn't matter what religion you were. They'd have a different chaplain every Sunday, and we all attended. If you were Catholic, you could go in, you could take communion, and at the time, I was a Catholic. If you were Jewish, you still went in. If Baptist, we all got along. There was never any question about religion. One was as good as the other. It's just a different time. Just really different. It was wonderful. I love this country.